Nothing lasts, not even atoms. What science and Buddhism say about impermanence. The Meeting Point, Episode 2. Science looks outward. Telescopes, particle accelerators, equations carved into blackboards. Buddhism looks inward. Breath, attention, the direct investigation of experience. Two directions, and increasingly, the same discoveries. This is The Meeting Point, Episode 2. If you've watched our earlier episode on impermanence, this comes at the same teaching from the opposite direction. That episode began inside, with contemplation, with the personal encounter. Today, we begin outside, with atoms, with equations, with the coldest law in all of physics. Same mountain, different path up. Right now, as you listen to this, your body is quietly replacing itself. Your stomach lining will be gone in a few days. Your red blood cells have about 4 months left. Your skeleton is remodeling itself over the next decade. And the average age of all the cells in your body, across every tissue, every organ, is roughly 7 to 10 years. But that average hides something extraordinary. Because your cortical neurons, the cells most directly associated with who you are, your memories, your personality, the voice in your head that is listening to this sentence. Those neurons are as old as you are. They were born when you were born. They will die when you die. They do not replace. So you might think, there is the fixed point. There is the thing that stays. But look closer. Those same neurons, the ones that persist for your entire life, are constantly rebuilding themselves at the molecular level. Their proteins have half-lives of 3 to 14 days. Their membranes, their internal machinery, their chemical architecture, all of it flowing through, replaced and replaced again, while the cell itself holds its shape. Imagine a whirlpool in a river. The pattern stays. The water never does. Not for a moment. You are not so much a thing as a process. 24 centuries ago, the Greek historian Plutarch described a puzzle. The ship on which the hero Theseus sailed was preserved in Athens for generations. Over time, every plank was replaced, old timber removed, new timber fitted. And the philosophers asked, is it still the same ship? 500 years before Plutarch named that question with a ship, the Buddha had already asked the equivalent question about persons. And his answer, when we reach it, may be the most liberating thing anyone has ever said about identity. But first, let's establish the fact that both traditions agree on, because physics has now confirmed, with extraordinary precision, what the Buddha taught through morning dew and mountain rivers. There is a law. It governs everything from your morning coffee to the fate of the universe. And it says, nothing holds. Act 1, the science, Entropy, describes. In 1865, a German physicist named Rudolf Clausius coined a word. He took it from the Greek, entrope, transformation, and he used it to summarize what he believed was the most fundamental truth about the physical universe. He wrote 2 sentences. They are still true. The energy of the universe is constant. The entropy of the universe tends to a maximum. That second sentence, entropy tends to a maximum, is the second law of thermodynamics, and it may be the most consequential statement in all of science. Here is what it means. Take a deck of 52 cards. There is exactly one arrangement where they sit in perfect order, ace through king, suit by suit. But there are approximately 8, followed by 67 zeros of possible arrangements where they don't. Shuffle once. you will never, not in a billion shufflings, not in a trillion, accidentally produce perfect order. Not because some force prevents it, because disorder is so overwhelmingly more probable that order is, statistically, a miracle. That is entropy, not a mysterious force pulling things apart, pure probability, winning. There are so many more ways for things to be disordered than ordered that the movement from order to disorder is virtually inevitable. Your coffee cools. It will never spontaneously get hot again. The molecules that carried heat into the air will not by chance all rush back into the cup. They could, nothing in the laws of physics forbids it. But the probability is so vanishingly small that the entire age of the universe would not be enough time to wait. The British scientist Arthur Eddington called this the arrow of time. Entropy is the reason time has a direction. The physicist Sean Carroll put it plainly. The fact that you can remember yesterday but not tomorrow is because of entropy. And Carlo Rovelli, one of the most celebrated physicists alive, added, "In the elementary equations of the world, the arrow of time appears only where there is heat. Entropy is why the past is different from the future. It is why things age, decay, dissolve. It is why you cannot unscramble an egg or unburn a match or undo a single moment of your life." A man named Ludwig Boltzmann proved why. Boltzmann was an Austrian physicist born in Vienna in 1844, and his insight, arrived at in 1877, was deceptively simple. He showed that entropy could be calculated by counting microstates, the number of ways the invisible particles of a system could be arranged while still looking the same from the outside. The more microstates available, the higher the entropy. The tendency toward disorder was not a mystery, it was pure mathematical probability. He condensed this into a single equation, S equals K log W. It should have been a triumph. Instead, it nearly destroyed him. Because in the late 19th century, some of the most powerful figures in physics, Ernst Mach, Wilhelm Ostwald, denied that atoms were real. Atoms, they said, were a useful fiction, a calculating tool. You could not see them, could not weigh them, could not prove they existed. And Boltzmann's entire framework depended on atoms being real. His equations counted the arrangements of particles that his critics said did not exist. The attacks were relentless, professional, public, sustained. And Boltzmann, who likely suffered from what we would now recognize as bipolar disorder, could not endure them. On September the 5th, 1906, during a summer holiday near Trieste, the sea was calm, the sky bright. His wife and daughter went swimming. Ludwig Boltzmann stayed behind in the hotel room. He was 62 years old. He hanged himself. Months later, the French physicist Jean Perrin published experiments that confirmed definitively that atoms are real. Boltzmann's life's work was vindicated. He was not alive to know it. Today, if you visit the Zentralfriedhof in Vienna, the cemetery where Beethoven, Brahms, and Schubert rest, you will find Boltzmann's grave. On his tombstone, there is an inscription, one equation, S equals K log W, nothing else. The law that Boltzmann died defending governs everything. Stars burn through their hydrogen and collapse. Galaxies drift apart. The physicist Katie Mack describes the final state, a universe that is very cold and dark and empty and expanding all the time. In roughly 10 to the power of 100 years, a number so large it has no analogy in human experience, the universe reaches maximum entropy, a thin, impossibly dilute gas of photons and particles, barely above absolute zero. no thermodynamic process is possible. Nothing can ever happen again. That is where the arrow points. But you do not need to wait for the heat death of the universe to see entropy at work. It is working in you right now. We began with the body replacing itself. Let's return with more precision. Your intestinal lining, 3 to 5 days. Your skin, 2 to 4 weeks. Red blood cells, about 120 days. Liver cells, a year, perhaps longer. Fat cells, roughly 8 years. Bone, a decade. Skeletal muscle, perhaps 15 years. Your heart, less than 1% of its muscle cells replace each year. Less than half will be replaced in your entire lifetime. And your cortical neurons, the cells behind your thoughts, your memories, everything you call you, never. They are born once. They last as long as you last. And when you die, they die. So there it is, the fixed point. The thing that persists. Except those same neurons, every single one, are constantly replacing their molecular components. The proteins that make up a neuron have half-lives of days to weeks. The lipid membranes, the ion channels, the synaptic machinery, all of it turns over continuously. 90% of the neuronal proteome is in constant molecular flux. The cell holds its shape. Its matter flows through. A whirlpool in a river. The pattern endures. The water is never the same water twice. Jonas Frisén, a stem cell biologist at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, developed an ingenious method to date human cells. Nuclear bomb tests between 1955 and 1963 doubled the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. That carbon was absorbed by plants, eaten by humans, and incorporated into the DNA of every cell that divided during that period. DNA became a time capsule, and Frisén used it to measure, precisely, the age of different cell types in the human body. What he found, and what the media simplified into "your body replaces itself every 7 years," was this. The average age of all cells in an adult body is roughly 7 to 10 years. But that average is dragged upward by neurons that last a lifetime and pulled downward by gut cells that last days. It is a statistical ghost. No single cell type actually follows that 7-year clock. What is real is this. At the level of atoms, 98% of all the atoms in your body are replaced every year. Your water molecules exchange every 8 to 16 days. You are not the same material you were 12 months ago. You are the same pattern, running on entirely different matter. The novelist C.P. Snow once said he had asked educated people how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold and negative. Yet he was asking something which is about the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's? This is the second law. Everything ordered becomes disordered. Every pattern eventually dissolves. Every atom in your body is passing through. And physics, having described all of this with breathtaking precision, falls silent. It tells you what happens. It does not tell you what to do with it. It describes the fact. It offers no response to it. And this silence, is exactly where another tradition has something to say. Something it has been saying for 2,500 years. Sobriety moment. Carlo Rovelli, the physicist who showed us that entropy is why time has a direction, wrote something else, something quieter. He wrote, "We long for timelessness. We endure the passing of time. We suffer time. Time is suffering." And then, one line later, almost as an afterthought, he added, "This is time for us, memory, a nostalgia, the pain of absence." He paused there. and then he corrected himself. But it isn't absence that causes sorrow. It is affection and love. That is a physicist speaking, not about equations, about what it feels like to live inside entropy, to love something that cannot stay. We spoke a moment ago about Ludwig Boltzmann, the man who proved why disorder wins, who showed that the tendency of all things to dissolve is not a mystery, but a mathematical certainty. He understood entropy better than anyone alive. He could calculate it, formalize it, predict it, and on a bright September morning in 1906, while the sea was calm and his family was swimming, he could not find a way to endure its weight. His tombstone says S equals K log W. It does not say how to live with what that equation means. This is where physics leaves us, with the fact, and with the grief. The dissolution is real. The equations confirm it. The atoms leave. The cells replace. The stars burn out. And the people you love, every single one of them, are subject to the same law that governs coffee cooling and galaxies drifting apart. Physics does not apologize for this. It does not offer comfort. It describes. And this is where the Buddha begins. Act 2, the Buddhist teaching, Anicca names it. 25 centuries ago, long before Clausius coined the word entropy, long before Boltzmann counted microstates, long before anyone measured the half-life of a synaptic protein, a teacher named Araka stood before his students and gave them 7 images. We do not know much about Araka. The Buddha himself tells us that Araka lived in an age when human lifespans were 60,000 years. Even then, even with 60,000 years to spend, Araka taught that life was short, that it vanished, that urgency was the only honest response. The Buddha quoted Araka's 7 images to his own monks and said, "If this was true when people lived 60,000 years, how much more true is it now, when a long life is merely 100 and 770? Here are Araka's images. Listen slowly. They are 25 centuries old, and they have not aged a day. The first, a dewdrop on the tip of a blade of grass that quickly vanishes with the rising of the sun and does not stay long. That is all. A single drop of water. The first light touches it, and it is gone. After this image, Araka said, "Next to nothing is the life of human beings, limited, trifling, of much stress and many despairs. One should touch this truth like a sage." The fourth, a river flowing down from the mountains, going far, its current swift, carrying everything with it, so that there is not a moment, an instant, a second where it stands still, but instead it goes and rushes and flows. Listen to the rhythm. 3 verbs, goes, rushes, flows, not 1, 3. Because the river does not pause to let you observe it. It does not slow down because you are watching. It carries everything with it, including you. Next to nothing is the life of human beings. The sixth, a sliver of meat thrown into an iron pan heated all day that quickly vanishes and does not stay long. This is not gentle. This is not the dewdrop. This is annihilation on contact. The iron does not negotiate. The meat does not resist. It is simply gone. Next to nothing is the life of human beings. And the 7th, the last image, the slowest. A cow to be slaughtered, being led to the slaughterhouse, with every step of its foot closer to its slaughtering, closer to death. This is the only simile that moves. The dewdrop vanishes, the river rushes, the meat is gone in an instant. But the cow walks, step by step, knowing nothing perhaps, or knowing everything, each step closer, not fast, not dramatic, just closer. Next to nothing is the life of human beings, limited, trifling, of much stress and many despairs. One should touch this truth like a sage. Do what is skillful. Follow the holy life. For one who is born, there is no freedom from death. 4 images: a dewdrop, a river, a sliver of meat, a cow walking. No equations, no carbon-14 dating, no microstates. And yet, the same truth that Boltzmann spent his life proving, that Clausius compressed into 2 sentences, that Rovelli calls the most profound insight of thermodynamics. Everything that arises dissolves. The Buddha did not need an equation. He needed 7 images and 1 refrain. But the Buddha said something else, something that goes beyond images of impermanence into the personal cost of living inside it. In a teaching near Savath, he asked his monks a question, SN 15:3. From an inconceivable beginning comes this wandering on, hindered by ignorance, fettered by craving. Which is greater, the tears you have shed over this long wandering, or the water in the 4 great oceans? The monks answered correctly. The tears are greater. And then the Buddha did something unusual. He did not move to the teaching. He did not pivot to liberation. Instead, he listed the losses. Long have you cried over the death of a mother. Long have you cried over the death of a father. Long have you cried over the death of a brother, of a sister, of a son, of a daughter. Long have you cried over the loss of relatives, over the loss of wealth, over the loss to disease, each one named, each one held, the refrain returning after every loss, crying and weeping from being joined with what is displeasing, being separated from what is pleasing. If you are listening to this, if you are 50 or 60 or 70 or 80, you have lived some of these losses already, perhaps most of them, perhaps all. And the Buddha, 25 centuries ago, did not say, "Get over it." He did not say, "Attachment is the problem, so stop feeling." He said, "Your tears are greater than the 4 oceans." He measured the grief. He gave it scale. He held it. The tears you have shed, they are greater than the water in the 4 great oceans. And then, only then, one word: enough. Long have you experienced stress, experienced pain, experienced loss, swelling the cemeteries. Enough to become disenchanted with all fabricated things. Enough to become dispassionate. Enough to be released. Listen to that word carefully. Enough. It carries 2 meanings at once. The first, you have suffered enough, sufficiently, completely, without shortage. The second, enough. It is time. It is time to stop. 3 movements follow that single word. Disenchantment, nibbida, not disgust, but clear seeing. You see things as they actually are, and the spell breaks. Dispassion, viraga, the grip loosens, not forced, not suppressed, simply released because you have seen clearly. And then, vimutti, freedom. The Buddha held the grief first. He measured it against oceans. He named every loss by name. And only after the full weight of it had been felt, only then did he say, "This is enough. There is a way through. This is not what physics does. Physics describes the dissolution. It confirms the impermanence. It can tell you the half-life of a carbon atom and the timeline of the heat death of the universe. But it does not hold your grief. It does not name your losses. And it does not say, enough. The Buddha does both. He looks at the same fact without flinching, and then he asks, now that you see it clearly, what will you do? That question, what will you do with impermanence, is where the two traditions begin to converge in a way neither could achieve alone. Act 3, the convergence, same diagnosis. So here we are, two traditions, two languages, one fact. Physics calls it entropy. The Buddha called it anicca. Both say the same thing. Nothing that arises is permanent. Every structure dissolves. Every pattern, eventually, lets go of itself. But let's be precise about what the same thing means, because the convergence here is not vague. It is structural. Entropy says, there are overwhelmingly more ways for things to be disordered than ordered. Therefore, every ordered system moves toward disorder. Not because something pulls it apart, because the math makes any other outcome virtually impossible. A shuffled deck does not return to perfect order. A cooled cup of coffee does not spontaneously reheat. A dissolved pattern does not spontaneously reassemble. The Buddha said, whatever is subject to origination is subject to cessation. SN 2259. Whatever arises, by conditions, by causes, by the coming together of elements, will, by the changing of those same conditions, come apart. Not because something destroys it, because that is what conditioned things do. Same logic, different vocabulary. Entropy speaks in probabilities. The Buddha speaks in conditions. Both arrive at the same conclusion. If something was assembled, it will disassemble. Not might, will. We saw this in the body. Physics gives us the breakdown. Gut cells in days, red blood cells in months, bone in a decade, neurons for a lifetime, but they're molecules flowing through every few weeks. You are a pattern running on constantly replaced matter, a whirlpool in a river. The Buddha mapped the same territory, not with cell types, but with what he called the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental fabrications, consciousness. SN 2259. 5 processes, not 5 things. None of them fixed, none of them stable. Each one arising, persisting briefly, dissolving, and arising again in a slightly different configuration. Physics says, you are not the same atoms you were a year ago. The Buddha says, you are not the same aggregates you were a moment ago. The time scale differs. The insight is identical. You are not a substance. You are a process. And processes, by definition, do not hold still. Which brings us back to the ship. Plutarch's question, if every plank of the ship is replaced, is it still the same ship? Has troubled Western philosophy for 2,000 years. It troubles because the question assumes there was a fixed ship to begin with. An identity, a self, something underneath the planks that makes the ship this ship and not another. The Buddha's teaching of anatta, not self, dissolves the question rather than answering it. There was never a fixed ship. There was never a single, unchanging identity underneath the changing planks. There was only a pattern of conditions: wood, design, water, use, memory, and patterns can change without anything being lost because there was nothing solid to lose. The philosopher Derek Parfit, writing in 1984, knowing nothing of the Buddhist debates that preceded him by millennia, arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion. He described what happened when he stopped believing in a fixed self. He said that he had felt imprisoned, as if his life were a glass tunnel through which he moved but could not escape. And when he changed his view, when he released the idea of a permanent, unified self, the walls of the tunnel disappeared. He said, "I now live in the open air." Parfit noted the similarity to Buddhist claims. He found it remarkable that Western thinkers, with no knowledge of the Buddha, had reached the same conclusions, and he suggested this convergence was evidence not of cultural borrowing, but of truth. The physicist Carlo Rovelli has explored this convergence more directly than perhaps anyone writing today. In his work on entropy and time, Rovelli showed that our experience of time, memory, nostalgia, the feeling that things pass, arises from entropy. Without entropy, there would be no before and after, no loss, no change, no grief. Time, as we experience it, is entropy felt from the inside. And in a separate work, Rovelli turned to the 2nd century Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna and found what he called an immediate resonance with quantum physics. Nagarjuna's central thesis: nothing exists in itself, independently from something else. Everything is relational. Everything depends on conditions. Rovelli wrote, "Understanding that we do not exist as autonomous entities helps us free ourselves from attachments and suffering." And then, a sentence that could have come from a Buddhist text. He added, "Precisely because of its impermanence, because of the absence of any absolute, the now has meaning and is precious." Now, an honest note, Rovelli's writing on entropy and his writing on Buddhism appear in different books. He did not, in a single passage, draw a line from the Second Law of Thermodynamics to Buddhist liberation. That bridge, the connection between entropy as a physical law and anicca as a path to freedom, is this video's synthesis. It is grounded in what both traditions point toward. But the explicit connection is ours to make, not his. What we can say is this: a physicist who has spent his career understanding why all things dissolve, and a tradition that has spent 25 centuries teaching how to live with that dissolution, have arrived at the same starting point. Everything is impermanent. Everything is conditioned. Everything that arises will cease. They agree on the diagnosis. Where they diverge, where the Buddha goes further, is what comes next. Act 4. Buddha goes further. Impermanence as liberation. Physics gives us the fact. Entropy explains why. The second law is confirmed by every experiment ever conducted. No exception has ever been found. The atoms leave. The cells replace. The stars burn through their fuel and collapse. The universe, on a time scale beyond imagination, goes dark. And then physics stops. It describes. It does not prescribe. It tells you that your coffee will cool, that your body will age, that everything you build will eventually come apart. But it does not tell you what to do with this. It has no chapter on grief, no equation for how to hold what you love while knowing it will not last. The Buddha looked at the same fact, the same dissolution, the same impermanence, confirmed now by 25 centuries of contemplative observation and 3 centuries of physics, and asked a different question. Not, why do things dissolve? But, what is your relationship to the dissolving? Because the suffering, the Buddha taught, does not come from impermanence itself. It comes from the refusal to acknowledge it, from clinging to what cannot be held, from treating the impermanent as though it were permanent, the unreliable as though it could be depended upon, the changing as though it would stay. The Venerable Thanissaro Bhikkhu, one of the most rigorous translators of the Pali Canon working today, makes a distinction that changes everything. He prefers to translate anicca not as impermanent, but as inconstant, or even more precisely, unreliable. The difference matters. Impermanent suggests it ends. That is sad. Unreliable suggests you cannot depend on it. That is actionable. You let go not merely because something ends, but because you recognize that it cannot support the weight you are placing on it. You are not grieving a loss. You are correcting a strategy. You were leaning on something that was never designed to hold you. And here is where the Buddha's teaching becomes something that physics, for all its precision, could never offer. Entropy, the tendency of all ordered things to dissolve, is not, in the Buddha's framework, a problem to be solved. It is permission. Permission to stop clinging. Permission to release the grip on what cannot be held. If impermanence is the nature of all conditioned things, and physics has now confirmed this at the level of atoms, cells, stars, and the universe itself, then non-clinging is not resignation. It is not giving up. It is alignment with reality itself. Clinging to the impermanent does not make it permanent. It makes you unstable. It adds a second layer of suffering, the suffering of resistance, on top of the suffering that was already coming. You cannot stop your coffee from cooling. You cannot stop your cells from replacing. You cannot stop entropy, but you can stop fighting it. And in that stopping, the Buddha taught, something opens. This is what both traditions seem to suggest, each in its own language. Physics says, the impermanent cannot be preserved. The Buddha says, so stop trying, and discover what happens when you do. The Buddha's own chain, from the teaching at Deer Park, SN 2259, is form constant or inconstant? Inconstant, Lord. And is that which is inconstant easeful or stressful? Stressful, Lord. And is it fitting to regard what is inconstant, stressful, subject to change as, this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? No, Lord. Seeing thus, disenchantment. Through disenchantment, dispassion. Through dispassion, release. Not suppression, not denial, not forcing yourself to stop caring, but seeing thus, seeing clearly, seeing what entropy already confirms, that the inconstant cannot be relied upon, and allowing the grip to loosen on its own. The word from the Tear Sutta returns. Enough. Enough to become disenchanted with all fabricated things. Enough to become dispassionate. Enough to be released. Thanissaro Bhikkhu writes, impermanence is the condition that makes liberation possible. If the five aggregates were permanent, if form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and consciousness were fixed, unchanging, eternal, you would be stuck with them forever. There would be no way out, no door, no release. Their inconstancy, the very thing that causes grief, is also what allows you to let them go. Entropy is not the enemy, it is the door. The universe runs down. Physics has confirmed it. The atoms leave. The cells renew. The neurons hold their form, but their molecules flow through like water through a whirlpool. Araka's dewdrop vanishes with the rising sun. The cow walks step by step toward what is coming. The tears you have shed are greater than 4 oceans. And somewhere in all of that dissolution, the Buddha said, there is a direction that doesn't dissolve, not because it clings to existing, because it doesn't depend on existing to begin with. Science describes. The Buddha goes further. That has been the pattern of this series, and it is about to deepen because the next question is not about what dissolves, it is about what connects. Teaser, Episode 3. We have seen that nothing lasts, not atoms, not cells, not stars, not the universe itself. But here is what physics has also found. In your body, right now, there are 38 trillion bacteria, more cells than the ones you call yours. They digest your food. They regulate your immune system. They may, and the research is still early, but the evidence is growing, affect your mood, your cravings, even your thoughts. Are they you? Are you them? Where does you end and not you begin? The Buddha had a word for what you actually are. and it dissolves the question entirely. Next time, The Meeting Point, Episode 3. Nothing exists alone.